Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. It's been a while again, but I'm here, summer is almost over and I'm back with a video that I've started to work on in spring at I think towards the end of April, May, something like that. But life got in the way, I got busy, and here we are at the end of August. I've finally managed to finish it. Like you've probably seen in the title, today's video is going to be about John Green, kind of looking back at his work through the perspective of my adult self. Because if you've seen any of my past videos where I deal with and talk about books that are more popular or commercial, I tend to mention that I'm not a hater towards generally commercial books because I do like and I did enjoy John Green's work. I realized at some point that I haven't actually read John Green since Turtles All the Way Down came out, and I think that was in 2017 or 2018, so quite a while back, which means I don't really have an updated opinion on his works. Now, just as a quick background, I was a teenager when John Green gained his worldwide success with The Fault in Our Stars, and so technically speaking I was very much the target audience for this novel. That being said, me being the little pretentious and elitist teenager that I was, I wasn't really interested in what books were very popular at that time. However, I did get to read The Fault in Our Stars because my friends recommended it to me. A fun fact, it was also the first book I've ever read in English and I really enjoyed it. I had a good experience reading it, so I was left with a pretty positive opinion of John Green as a whole. Now, later down the line, I also discovered the Vlogbrothers and I discovered John Green's online content, which I also really enjoyed, especially because he tends to have this more optimistic perspective over life in general, but without being toxically positive. So he's still acknowledging all the horrible things that go on in the world, but he encourages, I think, himself and his audience to take this attitude of wanting to change something, no matter how little, because any little change will contribute to a bigger one. And I think we do need these more optimistic perspectives over the world, because it's very easy to get overwhelmed by how much is going wrong with the world. So all of this is to say that John Green became, like I've mentioned in other videos, one of the only popular / commercial writers that I liked. But obviously, I think it goes without saying that my opinions have changed a lot as I grew up, and especially as I've pursued my degrees in literature. So this led me to asking myself, does John Green's work hold up to this new version and more mature version of myself? And are his works in any ways problematic? Now, when you ask the question, is John Green problematic? Obviously, I'm more thinking about his works, but I've also, out of curiosity, searched his name and the word controversy to see if anything popped up, and from what I've seen, he didn't do any horrible things, so he's pretty much a good guy from what we can see online. I think the more interesting question is when we ask, is his work problematic? So let's get into that. For this video, I chose to reread two of his novels, starting with Looking for Alaska, which was his debut novel, and of course, The Wild World phenomenon, The Fault in Our Stars. I feel like I couldn't have left this out in a conversation about John Green. This book centers our main guy and our narrator, Miles. He is an awkward and lonely teen who chooses to go to a boarding school outside of his state in hopes that he would make some friends and some real connections. At the school, he becomes friends with his roommate Chip, who is also called the Colonel throughout the novel, and who, despite telling Miles that he's not willing to drag him around and introduce him to his friend circle, that's exactly what happens. So through Chip, Miles gets to know his friend circle at this new school, and obviously in this friend circle we also find Alaska, who is this quirky, beautiful, mysterious girl with whom Miles falls in love instantly. The whole book is structured on two main parts, the before and the after, with the central event being Alaska's fatal car accident. Overall, I feel like in this novel you can find all the things that make John Green, but they're not as polished and as in other novels. So we have first a misfit main character who manages to find other misfits that he connects to and who has to learn how to deal with a huge loss in his life. The characters in this novel, especially Miles and his roommate Chip, are also plagued by the fact that they don't know why Alaska acted the way she did. They don't know whether she had an accident or it was a suicide. And after she dies, we also have this element of a mystery story because they're trying to track Alaska's steps and find out what happened and what was her intention in the night of the accident. A feeling that followed me all throughout this book is that it was pretty shallow. Even if Green attempts to tackle these more complex and dark subjects through the eyes of teenagers, which is something I can admire in his work, they are tackled in a very surface level way. More than that, similarly to my experience with Norwegian Wood, with Looking for Alaska 2, the more I thought about the story and the deeper I tried to go into Miles' motivation and his character and into Alaska's character and their conflicts and so on, the more disappointed I got. So let's get into that. And I'll start from our protagonist, Miles. Like I said, he is this isolated and misunderstood teen who doesn't have much friends at school, and for this reason he decides to go to a new school in hopes that he will get a fresh start and he will find a circle of people that he can connect with. I will point out though that the very introduction of our protagonist / narrator has an issue that will follow us throughout the novel, and that is this shallowness. We don't get a very clear reason as to why Miles is an outcast at his school, other than the fact that obviously it's convenient for the plot. One could even infer that he is actually the very reason he doesn't have friends and not the people around him, because he is quite judgmental of his schoolmates, and he says this about them: I was more or less forced to invite all my school friends, i.e. the ragtag bunch of drama people and the English geeks I sat with by social necessity. So he simply labels these two groups of people, dismissing any potential meaningful connection that could be possible, since they are all very likely also outsiders who don't fit with the popular kids in school. Miles, however, doesn't seem to have attempted to seek a real connection or to try to build relationships with these people, which makes him not very relatable. For whatever reason, he decided that these groups of people, the English geeks, the drama people, are not good enough for him. There's nobody there that he has things in common with or that he can relate to. What doesn't help is also so that we don't really understand what he doesn't like about his entourage at school. So he says that he has to spend time with them by necessity, but there's no clear reason why he doesn't feel like he belongs with these people. So whatever the reason for Miles being an outsider, in my opinion, his introduction in the novel paints him as a pretty shallow person, which is a trait that will follow him all throughout the novel, despite the fact that he does manage to make some friends at his new school. Miles' shallowness, and here I'm not only talking about that he is built shallowly as a character, but also that he is a shallow person in the book. So this trait follows him all throughout the novel. It is not only shown at the very beginning when he just dismisses his schoolmates, but is also reinforced when he first meets Alaska. We walked in. I turned to close the door behind me, and the colonel shook his head and said, "After 7, you have to leave the door open if you're in a girl's room." But I barely heard him, because the hottest girl in all of human history was standing before me in cut-off jeans and a peach tank top, and she was talking over the colonel, talking loud and fast. Now, it's worth saying that I don't think having a teenager's character be overwhelmed by a girl's looks is necessarily a bad thing, because adolescence, at the end of the day, is a time when amongst other things, people start to discover their sexuality. They start to find out what they're attracted to. So I wouldn't hold it against Green that his protagonist notices the hotness of a girl the first time he meets her. Now, the problem arises, however, when Alaska's looks and this aura of a mysterious and rebellious girl is all that Miles cares about. When he, similarly to the way he related to his classmates before, has no real interest in getting to know Alaska, because to him all that matters is that she is hot, she's cool, and he's only interested in being her partner, not necessarily her friend. Now, this is a good segue into what I think is the most problematic part of this novel, and that is Alaska as a character. The way she's built and portrayed, in my opinion, is based on a very shallow perspective over what girls are, and similar to the problem I had with Murakami's novel, I feel like she's portrayed as a girl potential partner, sexual or romantic partner first, and human second. You can say that we see her through Miles's eyes, and I could forgive this for the beginning had Miles's development also be about seeing Alaska as a fully formed human being at the end of the story. But I feel like as he's getting closer to her, he's not really learning anything about his friend. And Miles' attraction is front and center, even in the moments in the relationship when they're meant to have a heart-to-heart conversation, when they are supposedly creating a meaningful connection, which Miles completely overlooks. Let me give you an example for this. In this scene, they're having a conversation that was sparked by something they talked about in the classroom. It is a topic that leads to them talking about what they believe, getting into the purpose of life and so on. So they're having a pretty deep conversation, and this is what Miles thinks about. And now is as good a time as any to say that she was beautiful. In the dark beside me she smelled of sweat and sunshine and vanilla, and on that thin moon night I could see little more than her silhouette except for when she smoked, when the burning cherry of the cigarette washed her face in pale red light. But even in the dark I could see her eyes, fierce emeralds. She had the kind of eyes that predisposed you to supporting her every endeavor. And not just beautiful, but hot too, with her breasts straining against her tight tank top, her curved legs swinging back and forth beneath the swing, flip-flops dangling from her electric blue painted toes. It was right then, between when I asked about the labyrinth and when she answered me, that I realized the importance of curves, of the thousands of places where girls' bodies ease from one place to another, from arc to foot, ankle to calf,
from calf to hip to waist, to breast, to neck, to ski slope nose, to forehead, to shoulder, to the concave arc of the back, to the butt, to the etc.
It's a pretty deep conversation that should be an opportunity for Miles to get to know Alaska better. And Alaska tries to give serious answers, so she tries to reflect upon herself and have this deeper connection, while Miles looks at her and only thinks about how hot she is. Throughout the novel, as they spend more and more time together, it becomes clear that Miles and Chip too never truly know Alaska. So despite being close to her, in proximity at least, they put little effort into trying to understand her desires, her hopes, her dreams, and her fears. They both kind of take it for granted that she is moody, but they never really try to understand where these come from, and which will be relevant obviously later down the line. Another scene that exemplifies how much Miles objectifies Alaska is this one. Like, after college, know what I want to do? Teach disabled kids. I'm a good teacher, right? Shit, if I can teach you pre-calc, I can teach anybody. Like maybe kids with autism. She talked softly and thoughtfully, like she was telling me a secret, and I leaned in toward her, suddenly overwhelmed with the feeling that we must kiss, that we ought to kiss right now, on the dusty orange couch with its cigarette burns and its decades of collected dust. And I would have kept leaning toward her until it became necessary to tilt my face so as to miss her ski slope nose, and I would have felt the shock of her so soft lips. I would have, but then she snapped out of it. So when she does attempt to open up in this interaction, Alaska tries to talk to Miles about what she'd like to do after college, so about her hopes for the future and how she'd like to contribute to society. When she does open up, Miles looks at her vulnerability as a gateway to be intimate with her, not because he sincerely wishes to support his friend, but because he really wants to get to sleep with her and to be her boyfriend. And this whole scene ends with Alaska telling Miles, "You never get me, that's the whole point." And despite Miles being faced and confronted with this fact that he never puts in effort to look at Alaska again as a person first and girl and hot girl second, he doesn't do anything to change his attitude, and it doesn't raise any problems in his mind that maybe I should be a better friend if I really want to connect to this person. Neither him nor Chip, for that matter, feel like they should change something in their relationship with Alaska, so they both prove to be pretty shitty friends in the end. As a quick side note, I finished writing the script after I've watched Obsession, and I couldn't help but draw some parallels between Miles and Bear, because they're both selfish and they are both unable to see the girl they're interested in as a person rather than the object of their desire and the solution to their loneliness and insecurity. But going back to looking for Alaska and to Chip and Miles being shitty friends, I couldn't help but feel like had they been better friends, had they been more involved in Alaska's life, they could have prevented what happened to her. Because it is only after her death that they become preoccupied with what happened, and they find out a pretty important detail of Alaska's life, which just goes to show how little they actually knew about her when she was alive. The big secret about Alaska is that she was living with this immense guilt because when she was 8, her mother had a seizure, and instead of her acting and calling the ambulance and doing something, she froze, which is a very understandable answer. So I don't think anybody would blame an 8-year-old child for doing that, but she feels very guilty for her mother's death. So she feels like she was the reason her mother died so early. She never fully opens up about this guilt that she carries with her though, but they do find out that the reason she left the campus in a frenzy the night of the accident was because she remembered that she had forgotten her mother's birthday, which obviously for Alaska just added on top of the guilt that she was already feeling. Alaska's perspective of her mother's death obviously becomes a defining characteristic, and that I think can explain, looking back at her behavior, can explain the instability in her moods. And I have less of a problem with her having this aura of a manic pixie dream girl, and more with the fact that she is used as a device to teach two young men about life. It's not necessarily the fact that Alaska and her death is an event that teaches them a lesson, but it's more the lesson they learn. Because after Alaska's death, the lesson they get isn't that maybe they should be more involved, they should be paying more attention to their friends, encourage them to be more vulnerable, to be more aware of what their friends are going through, but rather they learn that they shouldn't feel guilty about Alaska's death like she felt about her mom's death. So to sum up, I think the most problematic part of this novel is that Alaska isn't a fully formed character, but she's this cool, mysterious girl seen through the eyes of an insecure teenage boy who can't fathom the fact that she's a full person. She's fun to hang out with, especially when she acts as one of the boys and tells funny stories, such as the time when she was groped by a friend when they were watching a movie. Haha, harassment is so funny, but not so fun when she's moody and predictable. So when she does that, they take some distance from her. She is supposed to be this environmentally conscious feminist who refuses to iron a boy's shirt, but at the same time she throws cigarettes in the river and she offers to wear a burqa for her boyfriend so that he doesn't get jealous or she doesn't get stolen by someone else. She is of interest to Miles as long as she fits his objectifying ideal of what a cool girl should be, but obviously not when she needs to be vulnerable and when she needs a real friend besides her. So for these reasons, I would say that Looking for Alaska starts with an interesting premise and a lot of things I'd be willing to forgive because it's a teenage story and teenagers aren't exactly known for their emotional and overall maturity. But when you take an honest look at the lessons that we're meant to take from this story, I think they're all based on sacrificing a female character for the shallow growth of two shallow and annoying teenage boys, which is something I personally didn't like. Because if they would have learned that they should be better friends and they should be more interested in the personal lives of their the friends in their circle, that I think I could have forgiven a lot of these things. But that's not what they get from this book, so I didn't really enjoy Looking for Alaska. The more, like I've said, the more I thought about it, the less I liked it. Before I move on to the Fault in Our Stars, I do have a bonus rant about Looking for Alaska, which is irrelevant to the overall video. So if you want, you can skip to the next chapter where I go in and talk about the Fault in Our Stars. But if you're interested in someone who is Romanian complaining about the Romanian representation in Looking for Alaska, here we go. There is this side character who is part of the friend group called Lara Buterskaya, who is supposed to be Romanian. And as a Romanian myself, born and raised, this was one of the most annoying parts. This was what really got under my skin. First thing is the name. Lara could pass for a Romanian first name, although it's not necessarily common. But it's okay. If I were to meet someone called Lara, I wouldn't really think much about it. Buterskaya, however, is very much not a Romanian surname. Now, Romania does have Slavic influences, that's true, and there are quite a lot of Romanian names that do have Slavic origins. For example, I have a colleague in university whose surname was Tchaikovsky. That's not very common, again, but it does happen. I wouldn't have a problem with that. But when it comes to Lara's name, Buterskaya, this prefix aya, as far as I know from Dostoevsky's novels, this comes from Russian, where the surname has a female and a male version. So in this case, Lara's father will be called Butersky, and she, because she's a girl, she is called Lara Buterskaya. This doesn't happen, however, in Romania at all. You have the same surname for both men and women. That's one thing. And if it were only the name, I could have overlooked it. But John Green also gets Romanians speaking English very wrong. In the book, when Miles asks Lara about how she's accommodating to speaking a foreign language, she says she struggles with the soft E. And this soft E sound can be found in words like did, kid, middle, and so on. And because of that, in dialogue, John Green replaces the soft E with double E. So instead of did, we can imagine that Lara would pronounce it something like did. Besides looking stupid, this is not the case with Romanians speaking English. And I feel like I'm even more qualified to talk about this because besides being a Romanian who learned English, I'm also someone who teaches English. From my experience, I never had a student who struggled with the soft E because this is very much a sound that we do have in Romanian too, so it comes naturally to them. But there are some other sounds that we do struggle with, and in case John Green wants to add some other Romanian characters to his stories, I can give him some suggestions. The first one is the th sound. This is a very big problem for Romanians because we don't have this, and especially ones who start learning struggle with this sound. But you might also find more advanced speakers who still have an issue pronouncing the th sound. So if you speak to a Romanian, you might hear them replacing the th sound with a t or a s or a f depending on the word. So thinking might become thinking. If John Green is set on the E sound, there is something there too. Maybe he read about this, but he got it wrong, because something that doesn't come easily to Romanian is not the soft E, but it is the distinction between short and long vowels. Because again, we don't have this in Romanian, so when we start learning English, that doesn't come naturally to us. Because of this, you might hear a Romanian pronouncing the word beach like the word beach. This usually gets some laughs in the English lessons. Another example is pronouncing can't as can't, and this is again something that can be illustrated in writing, and it would be much more accurate to the experience of a Romanian speaking English, and also it could lead to some funny distinctions, because if you would have someone wanting to say beach but they say bitch instead, that could lead to some humor in dialogue. So you're welcome to use any of these, but I can assure you, in the name of all Romanians, we do not struggle with the soft E. We can pronounce it very easily. The Fault in Our Stars was John Green's 5th novel, and I must say that there is a noticeable improvement from Looking for Alaska. Overall, I felt like this book was okay for teenagers, but okay nonetheless. To start with, when compared with Looking for Alaska, the biggest improvement is the female character. And this time, Green chooses Hazel as a narrator, and he gets rid of the stereotypes that I talked about. What I felt worked very well in The Fault in Our Stars and didn't in Looking for Alaska is that John Green treats Hazel as a person with feelings, desires, and fears first and foremost, as opposed to Alaska, who is an object for Miles' desires first and foremost. This makes Hazel not only more likable, despite suffering from the typical teenage angst, but she is also more relatable to any kind of reader. So even if you don't have the exact experience she has, you can relate to her trying to navigate life as a teenager, to her fearing death and mortality. Obviously, the situation is changed by her cancer diagnosis, but still there are elements in her experiences that you can relate to. So this is a very nice improvement to see. From the very first time we meet her, we see that she is hyper aware of her mortality and how it will impact people around her. And we actually get to see that her biggest fear is causing suffering to the people that she loves. And that's why she isn't happy about that her parents' lives revolve around her, because she feels guilty about leaving them empty once her disease will become fatal. And this fear is encapsulated in a famous quote: "I'm like a grenade, Mom. I'm a grenade, and at some point I'm going to blow up, and I would like to minimize the casualties, okay? I just want to stay away from people and read books and think and be with you guys, because there's nothing I can do about hurting you. You're too invested, so just please let me do that, okay? I'm not depressed. I don't need to get out more, and I can't be a regular teenager because I'm a grenade." She is detached because she feels this responsibility to protect other people. She cannot protect her parents, obviously, because, like she said, they're already too invested, they're too involved in her life, but she can control the connections she makes with other people, and she can at least protect them. It is this fear that makes Hazel obsessed with finding out the end of her favorite book. She becomes very attached not only to the story itself, but also to the author, because he manages to express into words exactly what she feels, which is something, again, I think a lot of people can relate to. But Hazel takes this a step further, because in her mind, since Peter Van Houten knew so well how she felt, even though she never met Hazel, she draws the conclusion that he must also know what will happen after she dies. And I think, and this is why Hazel is so desperate to get answers from Peter Van Houten, because the fictional book, An Imperial Fiction, that Hazel loves and that is mentioned throughout the novel, has an open ending. So we don't know what happens, and Hazel doesn't know what happened to that main character. But since she thinks that Peter has this knowledge about what will happen, but what happened after the main character in An Imperial Fiction dies, and as a result, after Hazel will die, she has this desire to get answers from him. And I really liked this, because I feel like, as opposed to Alaska and her behaviors, I feel like this time John Green really took his time to think about Hazel's situation and how this will impact how she relates to things like art. When Hazel does get to meet Peter Van Houten, she is met with the harsh reality that her favorite writer is just another person, and just another flawed human who doesn't really have any answers, who is rude and dismisses them, and he obviously cannot put Hazel's worries at ease. And if anything, I feel like the meeting with Peter fuels her fear, because she sees this person who's lost someone to cancer be overwhelmed by this loss and not dealing with it very, very well. Now, throughout these experiences, Augustus, or Gus, who is Hazel's love interest, is there to challenge her perspective and offer her another way of thinking. Now, if Hazel is more pessimistic, obsessing over how her death will impact others, Gus is more focused on getting to enjoy the life he gets, however short it might be. So afterward, while I was getting eviscerated by chemo, for some reason I decided to feel really hopeful. Not about survival specifically, but I felt like Anna does in the book. That feeling of excitement and gratitude about just being able to marvel at it all. So he has a more optimistic view, not ignoring their reality, but choosing to look at, let's say, the bright side of things. And I think this attitude rubs off on Hazel because he eventually allows herself to fall in love with Augustus, and they start to live their short but very meaningful love story. At the end, Augustus' death is the final lesson for Hazel, kind of like in Looking for Alaska, but this time again it was more thought out, because Hazel learns from this experience that just because love comes with this risk of being hurt by losing that person and suffering after you lose them, it doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing it, and it doesn't mean that it won't add something to your life. And I think it also puts things into perspective for her, because while Hazel is very obsessed about how her death will impact others, she never believes that she herself can be impacted by the death of other people. So in the end, she gets to experience on her own skin what she was so afraid of. I think it's that what puts her mind at ease, because she realizes that just because Augustus dies very, very early and they didn't get to have this full love story, she wouldn't give that up if she had the option. So as I said, looking at this book overall, it's pretty okay, and definitely an improvement from Looking for Alaska. However, there are still things that bothered me while reading this book and that took me out of the story. While not as infuriating as Alaska's shallow and stereotypical portrayal, I still feel like they are worth mentioning. First and foremost, and this is something I've seen other reviewers complain about, is that Hazel and Gus are very pretentious, and I very much agree with. To some degree, I think this could be part of their character because they are teenagers, and as someone who has kept diaries since my teenage years, and I have the opportunity to go back and peek through my 16-year-old mind, I can tell you that I was myself very pretentious. So to some degree, this pretentiousness, I think, comes naturally because when you're a teenager, you become aware of complex aspects of life, but you're still too young to fully grasp them and understand them. So I feel like that's where this pretentiousness comes from. It's this willing to be deep, but you're unable to do so because you're still very much a child. My bigger problem is that this, although it's a characteristic of both Hazel and Augustus, it's inconsistent. Gus is supposed to be this very chivalrous boy who attempts to speak like an old-time gentleman. He addresses Hazel with both her first and middle name, so he always calls her Hazel Grace, which is fine by me. Make him this pretentious little boy who tries to emulate vintage speech to attract a girl. But there are some points where his chivalry goes out the window and all of a sudden he becomes a very direct and almost crude teenage boy. For example, thank you for wearing that dress, which is like, wow. This is when they're in Amsterdam in the fancy restaurant. And I feel like Gus, the way he's portrayed up until that point, would have given Hazel a more thought out compliment within the context, because they're in this very formal context. So I feel like he would have tried to be himself a little bit more formal and more chivalrous. Moving on to Hazel, she is also pretty inconsistent. And we are led to believe that Hazel is this very smart girl, especially for her age. We are told she attends some college classes, so the implication is that she's a bit more mature in her thinking. She reads a lot, so there is this suggestion that she has a better grasp on complex topics compared to other teens her age. But to me, when you look at her behavior and her ideas, I think she's very much what you'd expect from a 16-year-old girl. Why are breakfast foods breakfast foods? I asked them. Like, why don't we have curry for breakfast? Hazel, eat. But why? I mean, seriously, how did scrambled eggs get stuck with breakfast exclusivity? You can put bacon on a sandwich without anyone freaking out, but the moment your sandwich has an egg, boom, it's a breakfast sandwich. I don't want to have breakfast for dinner, I answered, crossing knife and fork over my mostly full plate. I want to have scrambled eggs for dinner without this ridiculous construction that the scrambled egg inclusive meal is breakfast even when it occurs at dinner time. Overlooking the fact that this is a very Seinfeld-coded conversation, and I'm pretty sure there is a Seinfeld episode that tackles this very topic. Question Hazel asked, this goes to show her teenage pretentiousness. Because in my opinion, had Hazel been as smart and as wise as we're led to believe, she maybe would have pointed out how other cultures have different foods for breakfast and that she doesn't want to have the standard American breakfast anymore, rather than just asking why can't we have curry for breakfast. Because there are many other places that don't have the standard American breakfast. So her question, I think, shows that she's a pretty self-centered teen, unaware that places other than America exist. And put a pin on that because we'll come back to that. Now, the second thing that shows that Hazel is not as smart as Green wants us to believe is that she deems V for Vendetta a boys' movie, which I wouldn't really expect even from a teenage girl. And I say this because I was around her age when I first saw this film, and I was pretty struck and intrigued by the concept of a totalitarian regime getting to control every aspect of people's lives. And I remember I was also very impacted, and it's something that stuck with me to this day, by that famous part saying something like, I don't remember it exactly, but it was something like, behind this mask there's an idea, and ideas are bulletproof. Granted, my fascination might have something to do with the fact that I was born in a country which was ruled by a similar regime for somewhere around 50 years, and even if the younger generation, such as myself, haven't lived under it, we still get to suffer the consequences of that regime. To Hazel, however, all this goes over her head, and which I found interesting because there's another reference that has to do with totalitarian regimes. And this leads me to what is maybe the most problematic part of this book, and that is the Anne Frank museum scene. If you're not familiar with the book and you don't know what I'm talking about, or maybe if you chose to erase this from your memory, let me refresh things for you. So after the disastrous meeting with Van Houten, Hazel and Gus go to the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam, which is placed in the annex where the family lived for 2 years before they were found by the Nazis and sent to concentration camps. Augustus Waters, I said, looking up at him, thinking that you cannot kiss anyone in the Anne Frank house, and then thinking that Anne Frank, after all, kissed someone in the Anne Frank house, and that she would probably like nothing more than her home to have become a place where the young and irreparably broken sink into love. The kiss lasted forever, as Otto Frank kept talking from behind me, and my conclusion is, he said, since I had been in very good terms with Anne, that most parents don't know really their children. I realized that my eyes were closed and opened them. Augustus was staring at me, his blue eyes closer to me than they'd ever been, and behind him a crowd of people, 3 deep, had sort of circled us. They were angry, I thought, horrified. These teenagers with their hormones, making out beneath a video broadcasting the shattered voice of a former father. I pulled away from Augustus, and he snuck a peck onto my forehead as I stared down at my Chuck Taylors. And then they started clapping. All the people, all these adults just started clapping, and one shouted bravo in an European accent. Augustus, smiling, bowed. Laughing, I curtsied ever so slightly, which was met with another round of applause. Now, I will give John Green some grace. I think it can be somewhat realistic to have 2 ignorant American teens thinking that it is appropriate to kiss, or thinking that they have some sort of pass to kiss in a museum commemorating the Holocaust because they are because they have cancer and they are broken and so on. Don't get me wrong, it's still very disrespectful. I wouldn't be that mad about it if it was acknowledged as something very, very, very disrespectful. Because what I find most problematic is not only Hazel's ignorance, American ignorance, I would add, but Green's too, because the fact that he chose to portray all the other visitors clapping and circling around this couple of teenagers kissing shows what Green thinks of people who choose to visit these places. Why would they clap for some teens kissing in a museum? They don't know their story, and even if they did, I can assure that in reality, had this happened, they would have gotten some dirty looks for not treating that place with the respect it deserves. Now, it's true, Anne Frank kissed in that place, but that place wasn't just Anne Frank's house. It was a place that housed two families for almost 2 years as they were hiding from the Nazis, so it wasn't this romantic place for first kisses. You can imagine there's people visiting that place who have family members that were killed by the Nazis, and I can assure you that they are not going to be impressed by two teenagers having their first kiss in a place meant again to commemorate the atrocities that were brought about by a totalitarian regime. But I think this is fitting because Americans don't really know the impact that the Nazi regime had on European countries. And to add on top of that, so not only do they clap, but they also say bravo in this well-known European accent. I mean, which one? Because in Europe, I've googled this, there are approximately 200 languages that are indigenous to Europe. So because obviously you also have immigrants and there are other languages present, but we're talking about languages that are indigenous to this region of the world, and each language has its different accents. So which accent is he talking about? I don't know. But this part, so if with other things that maybe I didn't like or they weren't for me, I can forgive it. This part, I feel like it should have been taken out completely, or at least people clapping, or have them kiss, but just mention that some people gave them dirty looks, but they don't care because, again, it's understandable why they don't care. And I can understand the fact that a young person dealing with cancer and having to be faced with their own mortality at such a young age, it does make you self-centered. It does make you care less about other problems in the world, which is not the end of the day, and I'm not going to blame them for that. But don't make it sound like people visiting the Anne Frank Museum will care more about two teens kissing than what happened to Anne Frank and her family. That is, I think, a boundary that was crossed, and it's something that really bothered me. Before I end the video, I feel like I cannot talk about The Fault in Our Stars without briefly mentioning its impact on pop culture, because this book was truly a phenomenon, at least for teenage girls at that time. It also sparked an entire genre of romance books and stories featuring sick teens. I'm not going to get too much into the copycat stories that came after and how they can be somewhat problematic, but there is this YouTube video that I recommend if you're interested in that topic. Going back to The Fault in Our Stars, however, I was interested to see how people who are represented in this book, so teenagers who deal with cancer, think about it. For me, someone who hasn't dealt with cancer, not personally, and I have also was fortunate enough not to have people around me deal with this horrible disease, I thought it was a pretty good portrayal. Despite my criticism, I thought the portrayal of living with cancer was pretty good, because Green doesn't use it as a quirky trait to make his book more interesting. He shows that it impacts the character's day-to-day life. Green doesn't shy away from showing the whole picture of what it is to live with cancer. So I, again, as someone who is quite ignorant about this topic, I thought it was a pretty good portrayal. But obviously I was curious what people who do live through this have to say. And from what I've seen on the internet, you can find both praise and criticism. Some praise I found said, I thought it was phenomenal, especially for the author not having cancer. He was spot on with how you're feeling. So someone who kind of mirrors Hazel's relationship to Peter Van Houten. Someone else said, I related to every single diseased teenager in this book. I have searched all over MD Anderson for my personal Augustus and fallen short, and I have mocked the nurses just like Hazel and Isaac do. So it did manage to impact the lives of teenagers that have to go through this horrible experience, and it did make them feel, by the sounds of it, it made them feel seen and less alone. But on the other hand, there are also some issues raised with Green's portrayal, and I found this, someone saying this, but if the only reason his main character is alive is because of a made-up treatment, isn't he glamorizing the scarce miracles and hope some cancer patient may have? By keeping Hazel falsely alive to share with us her newfound wisdom upon Augustus' death, does it not turn into her and her experiences becoming a lesson for healthy people? So this is an interesting point being raised. Obviously, it is an idealized version because it's a story, so it's very difficult to, and I don't think stories should necessarily portray the reality as it is. You are going to idealize some things, but it is an interesting point to think about. I've also found the YouTube channel of a girl who has unfortunately passed away from cancer, but she talked about the movie adaptation, not the book. However, she pointed out kind of similarly how it was a bit too idealistic when she related it to her experience. All this to say that obviously no piece of art or literature will be a perfect representation, and even if most people think it is, there will also be some criticism coming from the same community. And just because there are voices criticizing The Fault in Our Stars, which are very valid, it obviously doesn't invalidate the voices that did find representation in this story. I think this goes to show that despite its flaws and despite the Anne Frank incident, John Green did manage to create a compelling story that I think for the most part holds up even 14 years later. To conclude, after rereading John Green with a fully developed brain, I don't necessarily find his work problematic. I have problems with it, but I don't feel that it would be harmful for teenagers to read and engage with it when compared to other commercial and famous authors. I do, in a way, admire him because he does manage to, through his works, to shed light on experiences and things that teens and people in general are ignorant to. So like with cancer in The Fault in Our Stars, or with OCD and anxiety in Turtles all the way down. It's not the perfect representation, and look, no representation is going to be the perfect representation, but I do think, and for me at least, it did open up this window into how other people are experiencing the world, and it did make me curious to learn more about these things, even though I don't experience them personally. So for that, I think that he is a pretty good author for teens, at least. I am curious about his new book. If I'm not wrong, I heard he is coming out with a new fiction book. So because he had some non-fiction books after Turtles all the way down, but this I think he's coming up with a new fiction book, and I will read it because I'm curious about it, and because despite him being, again, very much a commercial author, his works being pretty simplistic and not necessarily very deep, I still think there's some value to them. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed me revisiting some of his works and looking at him through the lens of a mature adult. And let me know, have you been part of the John Green craze? That being said, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you reaching the end of the video. I would really love to read your thoughts in the comments if you have anything you'd like to comment on. And I hope I'll see you in my next video. Bye!